Policymaking is a serious topic with real repercussions. Yet, it's seldom discussed with the urgency it deserves. With Nigeria's population projected to reach 400 million by 2050, timely and effective policy formulation is essential. However, the process remains fraught with inefficiencies, lack of data, and bureaucratic hurdles. From identifying a problem to policy implementation, the journey is anything but straightforward. In this episode, we'll explore the intricacies of policy making in Nigeria through legislation. What does it take for an idea to transition from a concept to a law? How do societal needs influence policies? And why do so many fail to make a tangible impact? Our guests will unpack these questions and provide insights into the challenges and opportunities in shaping Nigeria's future. Welcome to the Leading Woman Show Policy Series, brought to you by the National Endowment for Democracy and Luminate. My name is Abosede Jojagan, and today we'll discuss how policies become law with our guests. Ibrahim Farouk, who has 14 plus years of experience in democracy, youth participation, and social movements. He's currently the program coordinator for Yiga Africa, Africa's division. He played a key role in the Not Too Young to Run movement. Also joining us is Omomi Ogunrotimi, a Nigerian legal practitioner and founder of Gender Mobile, an organization that championed the recently passed Anti-Sexual Harassment in Tertiary Institutions Bill. She's an advocate for women and girls and has supported 50 rural communities and impacted over 100,000 lives. It's great to have both of you here, and thank you so much for being on the show again. Today, we're going to be talking about how policies become law. And I'm really excited to have you both here to have this conversation. So let's dive in. First question to you, Ibrahim. What is the difference between policy and legislation? Because this is something that I hear people use interchangeably all the time.
Thank you, Abosede. I think that's a really great question because, like you said, policy and legislation are used interchangeably a lot of the time. And when you have conversations with a lot of people, they might be referring to legislation and they say, oh, we need to change our policies. And they may be referring to legislation or law and they're saying, oh, we need to change policies. And it's used to mean the same thing. Well, there are slight differences. When it comes to law or legislation, it's more legally binding. So laws are usually made by legislative bodies at a local level, for instance, at the local councils. That's across the 774 local government areas or area councils in the FCT. We have legislative councils that make bylaws. At the subnational level, that's across the 36 states, we have state houses of assemblies that also make laws for the state. And then at the national level, we have the National Assembly that makes laws as well. And there are different types of laws. A constitutional amendment can be a law to say there's something in the Constitution that you want to see changed. It goes through an amendment process, a bill is passed and it becomes a law. There can also be an executive bill, for instance, that comes from the president or at the state level, it comes from the state governor. It goes to the National Assembly or the State House of Assembly and it becomes a law. Even things like the budget is a law. It's called the appropriation bill. The State House of Assembly or the National Assembly considers the provisions of that bill and then passes it into law. So for policy, on the other hand, is a set of regulations or guidelines that help to shape actions that decision makers take. So for instance, you could have an education policy, a health policy, a gender policy with certain stipulations within the policy. So if, for instance, your gender policy says there should be 35% of all appointments given to women. However, policies are not legally binding when you compare them with law or legislation. I think that's the main difference between policy and legislation.
Mommy, do you want to contribute to that?
Yeah, so just to build on what Ibrahim said, I would say that in essence, the major differences actually also cuts across how it's created in terms of also amendments. So when you want to amend laws, for example, the process is quite rigid. But when you want to amend policies, you know, the process is much more easier.
Right.
And also in terms of enforceability, you perhaps have to get to the court of law to enforce, you know, a legal framework. But when you talk about policies, because it's more persuasive and it can be created by an institution, an agency of government, and as such, you do not, you know, require a court of law to enforce, you know, a policy for you. So I think it cuts across essentially the process of creation, the process of amendment, and also its enforceability.
And who's involved as well, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right. Because I think that's a distinction that people also maybe don't understand. The difference between what the executive does, what the legislative does, and who does what, in terms of the fact that legislators are to make laws. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, Ibrahim?
Yes, definitely. Because even when you talk about policy, you can have private policy and you can have public policy.
Right.
So even private organizations or institutions have policies that guide their operations. Even within your organization, I'm sure there are policies that guide human relations, how employments are made, and the whole gamut of the operation within your own organization. But we also have public policy, which is within the realm of public institutions. So you're talking about government ministries, departments, and agencies. So the Ministry of Education, for instance, would have an education policy. The Ministry of Women Affairs might have a women's policy or a national gender policy like we have. The Ministry of Youth Development would have a national youth policy, and we actually do have a youth policy. So that just speaks to the nature of the people involved in the process and in developing the policies. But like you also mentioned, the executive arm of government is involved in policy formulation and implementation, while the legislative arm of government, National Assembly, state houses of assembly, and the legislative councils are involved in making laws and legislation.
Absolutely. So, Omami, I want to start with you. Your organization recently championed the Anti-Sexual Harassment in Tertiary Institutions Bill. Why, I mean, if you can tell us the story of why you thought a bill or legislation was necessary, why couldn't it be a policy? And even walk us back to what the problem was and why it was so important for this to be backed by legislation.
Thank you very much for that question. I think it's important to state that sexual harassment is highly prevalent in Nigeria, and more specifically in tertiary education institutions, especially because it is a space that is, you know, characterized by power asymmetry. And so there's a World Bank report that indicates that 70% of female undergraduates experience sexual harassment.
Wow.
By every standard, that is an epidemic proportion.
That's right.
Yeah, so that means 7 out of every 10 female students in higher education institution. So that prevalence in itself, you know, inspired the growing body of, you know, organizations and even individuals to start advocating for policies. And it's also important that I state that in 2018, what set out to, you know, create a technology-driven platform, essentially for people to report cases of sexual and gender-based violence across communities. And within 1 year of setting up the call center infrastructure, we recorded, I think, about 240 cases, 237 specifically, and 80% of the cases emanated from campus communities.
Wow.
So we realized that it was a very huge problem in learning environments. So with the context-specific data, we moved into campus communities. and we realized that policies were largely non-existent. Reporting mechanisms were also largely non-existent. So we piloted in 4 higher education institutions to support them to put context-specific policies in place. Again, I'm tying this to the question around, why not a policy,
Yes.
instead of championing the cost for a bill? So when we piloted in 4 higher education institutions, again, we realized that there was a problem with definitional clarity. People didn't even understand what sexual harassment was. So when they experienced it, they didn't realize that it was sexual harassment. So what that did was to continue to perpetuate the culture of sexual harassment in itself. And unfortunately also, a lot of people felt if it wasn't quid pro quo, it wasn't sexual harassment. That's
Please,
the
can
beef
you
for that.
educate us what pro quo is? We're not
Oh,
lawyers.
okay. Sorry
I'm dressed
about
as
that.
one, but we're not
Yes.
lawyers.
So there are 2 types of sexual harassment. We have the quid pro quo, which is popularly known as sex for grades, which people call sextortion.
Yes.
We then have the hostile environment, which is the more subtle form of sexual harassment, largely unreported, also largely normalized. It has been deeply ingrained into the culture and the system of environments in general, churches, learning environments, workplaces, and the likes. So because people do not experience that a lot, they also assume that they are not experiencing sexual harassment. And again, because educators have a lot of influence on the learning experiences and outcomes of students, they would rather find alternative means of solving these problems, which in itself is not a solution, but it further enables the perpetrator, because if you have to play ball because you just want to be out of the institution within the shortest possible time, you continue to embolden the perpetrator. So these are some of the issues that we realized at the time. And we took a lot of learnings from the engagement that even when institutions have policy, it's great, right? Because it's a form of accountability. When people experience this, they have something to fall back on, especially that the policy in itself also clearly stipulates grievance redress mechanisms. But again, we realized that we have over 1,000 institutions in Nigeria, higher education institutions. So having a policy on an institutional basis, it's something that is quite stretching. So we realized that it was really important for us to move away from policies, especially that policies, again, would only met out administrative sanctions.
Right.
So institutions would say, we have some level of autonomy. And at the time, we also realized that it was important to adopt a top-down approach where we're engaging with regulatory bodies and seeing how they can make this mandatory so that higher education institutions by default would have those policies. We wouldn't have to stress ourselves engaging them on a retail basis.
Yes.
So we saw that this was a lot of work for us to continue to engage institutions, one institution at a time, and also that regulatory bodies were not really cooperative.
Right.
So we thought it was really important for us to have a legal framework that would criminalize sexual harassment. And some people also say, oh, we have the VAP Act, Violence Against Persons Prohibition. Why are we then stressing about this? So the VAP Act provides for sexual harassment, no doubt, but it has only one section. And by every standard, a sexual harassment policy should be highly comprehensive. It should stipulate different definitions or description of sexual harassment. We may not be able to exhaust it because it has a transitioning character, right? It keeps evolving and there are emerging patterns of sexual harassment. But at least a policy that is comprehensive in itself or a legal framework would set the tone to address such issues. And even policies that would also provide for remedies, support system, and also met out sanctions. So these were the gaps in, existing frameworks. And with the bill also, coming into place, it has also changed a lot of things in terms of how we are reimagining how we should be addressing sexual harassment in itself. So it was really important at the time. Lagos State has a criminal law that addresses sexual harassment. Again, it has only one section. We also have the ICPC Act. A lot of times we've relied heavily on the ICPC Act to prosecute cases of sexual harassment. But also the ICPC is really big on, strategic litigation, but more recently they're focusing on prevention.
Yeah.
What that does is that it does not address other subtle forms of sexual harassment,
Yes.
because the ICPC will address it from the lens of abuse of power. So if you're not demanding for sex in exchange for grades, the ICPC might not be able to step in such situation.
Right.
So it's really important that there is a dedicated piece of legal framework. And this journey started as far back as the 8th Assembly. That was 2015 to 2019.
Can I just pause you there, and I will come back to the details of the journey, because
Right.
I think that there are other people who will be wondering, so if I have a pressing issue, societal issue, as you said, that I need to address, and as you mentioned, will not be solved by a policy, and I need to go through the legislative process, how do I go about that? And I want to come back, but Ibrahim, I want you to talk about, I mean, similar to what Omomi just shared, why did the Yaga Africa team, and I know you played a huge role in that, why did you think that an age reduction bill was necessary?
Thank you, Abosede. It was necessary because first and foremost was we identified a gap in the 1999 Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. And this gap was identified as a product of research. And so when we looked back, we went down memory lane, Nigeria's history, we realized that our history was a history of youth participation in politics and elections and governance. So if you looked at many of the key actors in our pre-independence, struggle for independence, post-independence, and even if you want to add the plethora of coups and counter-coups that we had from the 1960s up to about the 1980s, and maybe even the early 1990s, they were carried out by young people. So young people had a place of participation in our country's history up until 1979. And we had the 1979 Constitution that stipulated the age requirements for running for office. And in many of those requirements, the age for running for office was 25 years old. But in the Fourth Republic, which started in 1999, the age limits for running for office were increased. We do not know when and how that happened, but somewhere along the line that happened. And just so to let you know, from 1999, the age to run for president was pegged at 40. So that was the lower limit. To contest for Senate and governor was 35. To run for House of Representatives and the state houses of assembly was 30. And these are the requirements that are in the Constitution.
Yes.
To run for local government offices requires a state law. So what we did was to champion a constitutional amendment bill, an age reduction bill. And our proposal was to reduce all of those ages by 5 years. So we had one proposal in the House of Representatives that was to reduce all the ages by 5 years. And then we had another proposal in the Senate that was going to align the eligibility to run for office with voting age. What that meant was that once you turn 18, you can also run for office, whether you want to be president or governor.
Oh my goodness, yes. So, Ibrahim, I'm going to get you to hold that thought. We will take a quick break, and when we get back, we'll continue this conversation. Welcome back to the conversation. So, Ibrahim, you were talking to us about the Not Too Young to Run bill before we went away. And I'd like you to continue, because the information you shared, you heard the audience. They clapped, because many of them are like, I can run. I never knew this. So please, can you repeat that again, and then, sort of continue from the story and the steps that we're taking to finally get that passed?
Yes. So like I mentioned earlier, we had two proposals, and I think that is the first step when it comes to passing legislation at a national level or at a subnational level. A bill has to be read for the first time. It's called the first reading, either in the National Assembly or the State House of Assembly. So we had two bills, one in the House of Representatives, which was to reduce all the ages in the Constitution by 5 years, and another one in the Senate, which was to align the voting age with the age of eligibility to run for office. And we now had something called concurrence, where the House of Representatives and the Senate would agree on which version of this bill would be passed. Unfortunately, the Senate version was not accepted, but the one in the House of Representatives was accepted. So that was called first reading. And then for a constitutional amendment, you'd have a second reading. Now, the first reading is where the title of the bill is read out. It's not debated. It is just said, a bill for an act to amend the Constitution, and it states the different sections to be amended. The second reading, there is more of a debate. So where the sponsor of the bill now debates and makes his or her argument as to why this bill should be passed into a law. At this point, it is still a bill. It is not yet law. It is not yet legal. And I think it's important to make this point, because sometimes you'd see on the media that, oh, the National Assembly has passed a bill criminalizing this or establishing that. It might have just been read for the first time or for the second time, and it has not yet gone through that process of lawmaking. For a constitution amendment, because the Constitution guides our political life across the whole country, the constitutional amendment bills also have to go to all the state houses of assembly. And so it goes to the 36 state houses of assembly. And out of the 36 state houses of assembly, you need at least 2/3 to pass the bill by a 2/3 majority. So if it goes to Kano State, for instance, you need 2/3 of the members in Kano to also pass the bill. If it goes to Lagos, you need 2/3 of the members in Lagos to pass the bill. And you need at least 24 states, which is 2/3 of 36 to pass it. It comes back to the National Assembly. The National Assembly also reads it for the 4th time. It is cleaned up. It is sent to the president for assent. So that means the president also has to sign the bill. I know that lawyers have a debate about whether the president needs to assent constitutional amendments or not, or whether if he or she doesn't assent after 30 days, the National Assembly or State House of Assembly has a veto power, meaning they can override the president and still pass it into law. So throughout this process, as an organization and as a Not Too Young to Run movement, we had to build the capacity of other organizations, other partners who were engaging with lawmakers at the state level. So we wrote letters to all the State House of Assembly members across the 36 states. So over 900 personalized letters. So each lawmaker would get a letter, and if the lawmaker's name is Honorable Abosede, you get a letter saying, "Dear Honorable Abosede, from the Not Too Young to Run movement, we're calling on you to sign the bill when it comes to your State House of Assembly." 109 senators got personalized letters. 360 members of the states of the House of Representatives also got letters. But we also had a lot of media engagements. We had what we called National Days of Action in Abuja and across the states, where young people just marched peacefully to the State House of Assembly or the National Assembly with placards, and we were making our demands. We also had a National Day of Action to the president, where we marched to the villa. All of this was to ensure that the bill got passed. Because in a constitutional amendment process, if at any point it does not receive 2/3, either in the National Assembly or State Houses of Assembly, the process dies. It just comes to an end.
After all that work.
After all that work. So you have to wait for another assembly. That's a new assembly. So we currently have an assembly that's from 2003 to 2007. So if your amendment doesn't pass within this assembly, you'd have to wait for another assembly or another constitutional amendment process for it to go through that whole first reading, second reading, third reading. It goes to the State House of Assemblies, comes back for fourth reading. It goes to the president for assent before it finally becomes a constitutional amendment.
Fantastic. I mean, let's give them a round of applause. I'm sure many of us are beneficiaries of that work. But Amomi, yours was not a constitutional amendment, right? So again, can you walk us through? You said your journey, as Ibrahim was just saying, started from the 8th assembly. We're currently in the 10th assembly. So tell us the story, who you engaged, what you did to get to this point.
Thank you very much for that question, and thank you for sharing, Ibrahim. So in the 8th Assembly, the bill was sponsored by, it was a private member bill, just like it distinguished between executive bill and a private member sponsored bill. So it was sponsored by Senator Vioma Agege, representing senatorial districts in Delta. And it was met with stiff resistance in the 8th Assembly. And there was no much noise about it in the 8th Assembly. And it was also during that time that, of course, because it was met by stiff resistance at the Senate, it did not move to the House of Reps. So, but in the 9th Assembly, which was 2019 to 2023, it actually enjoyed a lot of support.
Can I just add, is that because of what was also happening in society? Because this period that you point to between 2019 and 2023, if I remember correctly, was when we had the issues, public issues on sexual harassment sort of becoming more prominent. Would you say that that contributed to this journey?
Yeah, so that sort of contributed to it because in 2019 we had the BBC Sex for Grades video.
That's correct.
Yeah, and there was a lot of outcry, you know, on issues bordering on sexual harassment.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's largely contributed to it. So during that time also, of course, because of the smooth sail at the Senate, it was transmitted to the House of Reps, and the House of Reps also gave a concurrence. But before then, you know, there were areas of disputes between the Senate and the House of Reps. So usually when a bill moves from the committee, the standing committee, and then a report is brought back to the General House, which we call the Committee of the Whole, to adopt the report, and then it's transmitted to the second house. So here from the Senate to the House of Reps. So there were specific areas where the two houses did not agree. So at that point, you have what we call the conference, a conference committee, where there are members of the House of Reps and also the Senate coming together to agree on those areas. So when they agree on those areas, there's a joint report. So the two houses, that's the Senate and the House of Reps, they go back to the Committee of the Whole, that's the plenary, to submit the report, and then they individually adopt the report. So once that is done, of course, the clerk cleans up the document. It's endorsed by the Senate President and maybe the House of Reps Speaker, and then it's transmitted by the clerk of the National Assembly. So there's the clerk of the House of Reps, there's the clerk of the Senate, and there's the clerk of the National Assembly.
Right.
Yeah, so there's a process called an enrollment process that then, you know, after that, there's an onward transmission to the table of the President. Just like Ibrahim submitted, the President has 30 days to sign the bill into law. If the President does not agree to some specific provisions, he can return it back to the National Assembly for such provisions to be further amended. If the National Assembly agrees to it, they can do the needful and then send it back to the President. But again, if the President decides to veto it and not sign the bill into law, the National Assembly also reserves the right to then sit on it again and then pass it into law. But that's a rarity. I think it's only happened just once in the history of Nigeria, and that was when the NDDC, you know, was brought to life. That's the Niger Delta Development Commission, and there was a lot of, you know, backlash regarding that at the time. So in essence, this bill, the sexual harassment bill, was passed in the 9th Assembly. Unfortunately, we couldn't secure the presidential assent to that bill. And there are a lot of factors responsible for that. I think the process of the bill in the 9th Assembly did not start early enough. And so at the time when the Joint Committee sat and it was transmitted to the President's table, it was towards the end of the 9th Assembly. And usually, the National Assembly is an institution, but there are assemblies. So just like we have the 8th Assembly, the 9th Assembly. The President came in, and what that means is that he would not attend to any bill in the previous assembly.
Yes.
So as a matter of fact, in the 9th Assembly towards the tail end, Nigerian students came together. They donated about 8,000 pence to Mr. President. There was a lot of campaign, because they just kept wondering why the bill was standing.
Sign it, if you don't have a pen.
So some of them, they donated all sorts of pens, black, green, red, and were like,
you need.
Mr. President, the pen is the most important tool that a student has. So in our magnanimity, we're donating this pen to you to sign this bill into law. Unfortunately, because of the end of the tenure, the president couldn't sign that into law. And so here again, we had the 10th Assembly, and the good thing is that we're not starting all over again. So what we've done is to find an ally who sponsored the bill, and this is someone who has an interesting trajectory in issues affecting women and girls in Nigeria. So he took on this assignment again. It went through the first reading, the second reading. Because of the entire process that happened in the Ninth Assembly, there was a recommittal process. So, and that's the interesting thing about this. So there was no public hearing, because that would amount to, again, wasting resources and running the entire process again. So from the recommittal stage, there were a few amendments here and there, and then it passed through the third reading, cleaned up, and it's currently at the Senate. So we are hoping, and I guess this is also an opportunity to say, yeah, the Senate should do the needful, grant it their concurrence, so that we can perhaps leverage the 16 days of global activism to advocate for presidential assent to this bill.
Fantastic. So there's a lot that both of you have spoken about, but thank you so much for sharing and breaking down the process of lawmaking. I want to talk about inclusion in the process, right? Does it matter, one, who champions, a policy or whatever it is becoming law or an issue? And does it matter that you have an inclusive legislature, for example, to be able to bring that to pass? Ibrahim, what would you say about that? And if you can also layer on the transparency of the process, because you talked about public hearing, which is an opportunity for anybody, but the question is how many people take advantage of that with all the issues going on and how we're constantly complaining?
I think to answer your question, it's important to have allies and champions when it comes to passing legislation or policy formulation. And I think Wumi made the point around they had a champion, or they have a champion in the 10th Assembly. And it was very similar for the Not Too Young to Run movement, because at that time we had the Forum of Young Parliamentarians. But the Speaker of the 8th Assembly, Right Honorable Yakubu Dogara, was also a huge champion of the bill. And like we say in Nigeria, he carried on for a head. So he really championed the bill for us. So I think that is important. Having someone whose story aligns with the values of the bill that you're passing, or the policy
but is that not the problem,
formulate.
though? Because our assembly, the Senate currently has 4 women out of 109 and 16 women out of 360 in the House of Representatives. So we've been pushing for a gender quota, and it has just never happened because nobody don't carry on for head.
I totally agree with you. And I think since 2003, women's representation in the National Assembly has been steadily declining. And if we look at majority of the states in northern Nigeria, since 1999, many of them have never even had female representatives in the state houses of assembly. So that question of inclusion is very important, because for a country that is arguably 50% male, 50% female, maybe give or take 1 or 2% here, that inclusion is not reflected in decision-making spaces. In the Senate, like you said, 4 women. In the House of Representatives, I think about 16. You go to the state houses of assembly, the representation is abysmal. And I was in Jigawa just a few days ago, and my colleague asked a question: are there any women in the state house of assembly? And the looks on the faces of the people we were speaking to was enough to answer the question for us, because it was no. And it was also just saying since 1999, no, not just present day. So that's very important. But when it comes to inclusion, Wumi spoke about public hearings.
Yeah.
I think that's a very important way that we can include the voices of those who have been excluded. And civil society can also host citizen hearings, because if any one of you have tried to access the National Assembly, I'm telling you, it's quite tough to gain access into some of those spaces. But civil society organizations are also able to host hearings outside of the National Assembly space, or those spaces where it is difficult for citizens to access, and say those voices that have been excluded or marginalized, you have an opportunity to be heard.
Right. All right, so it's time for us to take another break. When we return, we'll take some questions from our audience. All right, so now we'll take questions from the audience.
Okay, thank you very much. My question is, why is public participation important in the lawmaking process?
Great. Ibrahim, do you want to quickly speak to that?
Yes, because laws that are made would affect each and every one of us, one way or another. And it's important that the input of every Nigerian, as much as possible, is taken into consideration in the process. So while we have a National Assembly and State House of Assembly, you have sent your representatives to speak on your behalf. But you also have another opportunity to speak some more if your representative is not representing you as much as you want. So if, for instance, there's a law that says you must be 18 years old before you get admission into a tertiary institution, but as a young person, you have finished secondary school at 16, you're going to sit at home for 2 years. But when you have public participation, you're able to say, look, there's no reason that at 16 you can't go to a university or a tertiary institution. So you have that divergence of opinions and interests, and strengthens the argument. It makes the law truly representative of the interests of the greater population, like we would say.
Fantastic. Do we have another question?
Thank you very much. So my question is, what would you consider to be a pressing issue that requires legislation?
That's interesting. So obviously, both of you have been part of championing critical societal issues that is being now backed by a legal framework. And I think what she's asking is, what are some of the other urgent issues that you think require? Mommy.
So I would say the first on my list is this issue of sexual harassment. Of course, that's why I'm here today. And we've been on this issue as far back as 2016, 2017. It's a pressing issue and it's really important. The other issue I would say that requires urgent attention is issues bordering on gender inequality generally. The Ninth Assembly, I recall that there was a lot of advocacy around the 5 gender bills. And the truth is that we need to begin to talk about symbolic and substantive representation. And it's until there is substantive representation that we would be able to address the systemic factors that continue to forge gender inequality. So I would say a pressing issue is issues bordering around representation of women across leadership positions, across governance, and across politics itself. That's critically important.
Fantastic. Ibrahim, what would you say?
Well, almost everything in Nigeria now is a pressing issue. But for some people, an issue is more pressing for you due to certain reasons. As a young woman, participation of women in politics might be more of a pressing issue for you. If you grew up in a community that is being affected by climate change, that might be more of a pressing issue for you. And we all have different pressing issues. And it's important to identify what the issue is for you and whether it takes policy or law to change it. Identify the issue, understand the process of policy formulation or passing a law, and how you can engage either as an individual or with the support of an organization. I wouldn't want to tell you what the pressing issues for you should be. But like Wumi mentioned, in the Ninth Assembly, we saw especially for the participation of women with what we call the 5 gender bills. And unfortunately, none of them were passed.
Yes.
I think that's a pressing issue that the current assembly, the 10th Assembly, needs to address.
Absolutely.
But for young Nigerians, there are issues of employment, education, the standard of living, the economy. I think all of those are pressing issues for us as well.
Fantastic. So those were really, really necessary questions from the audience. Now let's take it beyond the room and hear what people on the streets have to say.
Nah, no. Policy advisors. You have civil society organizations. You have the executive, and you have the legislature.
That would be the legislator and the executives.
Absolutely not.
Yes, it do affect us very well. Number one, there's no money in country. Well, the market we are buying, we are not buying the way we buy before.
Fine, educational policy towards women has affected my life positively because I went to school before I was able to become what I am today.
Ibrahim and Omomi, this has really been a great conversation. I would like to hear, what are your final thoughts? We've been talking today about how policies become law, and you've done a great job in sort of identifying or highlighting to us the difference between policies and laws, shared with us specific case studies. But if you were to think about what you would like to leave with our audience and people who will listen to this, what would you say? Let's start with you, Omomi.
Okay, so I see that we have a comparatively youthful audience here. So I would say that as young people, we need to be part of the process. And like they always say, that power is not served a la carte. So we need to ensure the processes center our participation, our voices, our expertise, and our unique realities. And one of the ways to do that is to also be knowledgeable about some of those processes. So I'm particularly excited that this edition is contextually relevant because advocacy starts with awareness, and this is an integral part of that. So thank you very much for having me.
Ibrahim, what would be your final thoughts?
It's so hard to go after Wumi said that. But to add, like she said, it's a very youthful conversation. And many times you've heard it say that our greatest resource as a country is not our oil, it's actually our youthful population. And we live in a time where we have access to so much information. We have the use of technology, we're innovative. We have so many solutions to a lot of the challenges that we have. When I go on social media, for instance, I see that lawmakers have social media handles and many of them engage. You can see that ministries, departments, and agencies also have social media channels, and they use that to engage. That's an opportunity to participate in the process. When we talk about policies, policies are usually reviewed after a period of time. And if you go online and search for any policy that you're interested in, you might find a small section that says this policy will be reviewed after every 5 years or 10 years. So if you look at the beginning and if it said this policy was passed in 2020, you know that by 2025, you should start to find which ministry, department, or agency formulated this policy so I can send in my inputs to review on social media, walk to their offices in Abuja or in the state capital. And it's the same thing for law or legislation. If you think there's a problem with a specific law, engage it and get it amended. Reach out to your lawmaker or your representative at a subnational or national level and come with solutions to say, there are gaps in this law. These are my amendments, my solutions to fix it, and engage in the process like Wumi said.
Fantastic. It's been such an insightful conversation on today's episode, and we would like to say a big thank you to our guests, Ibrahim Farouk and Omomi Ogunrotimi. To our audience, thank you for being such a valuable part of today's discussion. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media to share your thoughts on the episode using the hashtag on your screen. I'm Abosede Jojagan. Remember, women's leadership can change everything, everywhere. See you next week.